So welcome to our program tonight on Composting 101. My name is Susan McBride and I'm with the Hinsdale Library and I'll be presenting tonight's program. Tonight we will be covering the basics. What is composting? Why would you want to compost? Most importantly, how to go about composting. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about specific types of composters to help make your decision on which direction you want to go in. Let's start with what is composting. So, big picture, composting is a natural process. You're recycling your organic materials, such as leaves and food scraps, and you're turning them into valuable fertilizer that will enrich your soil in your garden, whether it's a vegetable garden or a flower garden, or even your indoor house plants. So you start with your materials. So you go to the store and you buy some carrots. What are you going to do with the greens on the top of the carrots? You'll cut them off, and typically you put them in the garbage. But when you compost, you're going to choose to put them in your compost bin or your compost pile instead. And eventually, over time, that compost pile is going to turn your vegetable greens into nutritious dirt or compost, which you can then spread on your garden to feed the carrots that you might be growing or whatever it is that you're growing. And then you get back to having these delicious carrots that you've grown in your garden using the compost that you created using the tops of your carrots. So it's somewhat of a cycle. And it's a natural cycle. It happens regardless of whether you do it or not. So a more sciencey definition of composting. In an undisturbed ecosystem, plants are self-feeding. They have carbon, they have nitrogen, and they have other essential plant nutrients that are released back into the soil when a plant dies. Composting is a process that actually just speeds up that natural decay of organic material by providing the specific conditions for detritus-eating organisms to thrive. This will produce a nutrient-rich soil that you can then put in your garden. Aerobic composting combines the advantages of air, moisture, and heat to decompose your organic materials. In your regular compost pile, there are billions of microbes, mostly bacteria, who love these conditions. They eat, they grow, they reproduce, and they die, and they are the ones that are responsible for creating your compost, and they help heat up a compost pile to speed it up. Now, in cold composting, which I will explain a little bit later on, bacteria are less of a player, but in hot composting, the higher temperatures created by the bacteria will speed up the process. So below 55 degrees, most of the microbes in your compost pile are going to be semi-dormant with very little activity and breakdown. But beyond, between 14 degrees and 68 degrees, psychrophiles will be present and they will reproduce, and this is the temperature that they grow at their best. And they will invade the compost pile and they'll begin to burn or oxidize the carbon that's in your compost pile from your kitchen scraps, and they will release heat and begin to heat up your compost pile. And below 55 degrees, the psychrophiles are present, but you may not notice the heat or you may not notice any breakdown of the pile. But as temperatures begin to rise, based upon the psychrophiles' activity, a new bacteria will come into play, and that's the mesophiles. And they grow best at temperatures between 50 and 122 degrees. Mesophiles are the bacteria that like to feed on our food and they cause our food to spoil quickly. They love food scraps, whether it's leftovers in the fridge or waste in your compost pile, and they're an important part of the composting cycle. And when new material is added to the pile and the temperature is cool enough for the microfiles, they'll start to work. And then once they get to work and the matter is broken down, then the pile becomes too hot for the mesophiles. And that's when the thermophiles kick in. The thermophiles will come in and they will do the hot composting work. They'll devote their 3 to 5 day lifespan to raising the temperature high enough to generate humic acid, which enables plants then to assimilate the nutrients in the compost. And voila, you have delicious compost for your garden. So that's a little sciencey. Let's get into a little bit about why you want to compost. When you compost, you are reducing waste that would have been tossed in the landfill, and you're reusing it to create compost. You're then going to feed your garden with the nutritious compost that you have created, and finally, you're going to improve the environment. How can composting impact the environment? Food waste is the single largest source of waste in the United States. There's more food waste that goes to landfills than paper or plastic, surprisingly. So when the food in your trash goes to the landfill, it ends up emitting methane, which is a greenhouse gas that contributes to climate change. So by composting, by removing your food waste from the landfills, you're actually minimizing methane emissions, and that will help the environment. But also, by creating compost and using that to feed your garden as a fertilizer, you're reducing the need for chemical options, which can also benefit the environment. So that's kind of the background on composting, but let's get into the nuts and bolts about how to compost. So there are basically 3 types of compost, and I'm going to get into details on each of them. But in general, there's hot composting, which literally means the compost pile heats up to speed the process of decomposition. And that's usually done in these compost tumblers or bins. There's cold composting, where the composting never heats up. And that's usually done in compost piles that are maybe tucked away in the back of your yard. Finally, there's worm composting, and that is where you use worms to help break down your food quickly and create a compost. Since composting is a natural process, it's a natural process of organic materials breaking down. It happens regardless what you do to it. So it makes it simple enough for anyone to do it. But by following some guidelines that I'm going to talk about tonight, you're going to be able to make your compost faster. You're hopefully going to make it more fertile, and you're hopefully going to be able to do it without having it smell bad or having some negative critters or flies or things collecting around it. So that's hopefully some of my tips tonight will help you avoid that. It usually takes anywhere from 2 months to up to 2 years to produce composting. And this will all depend on what method of composting you do. Compost will happen quickly in the summer when it's hot out, but it will come to a complete stop in the winter when it's cold. So you just want to know that there's a cycle to your composting. And I do have some tips for the winter as well. And once compost is ready, you will know it's ready because it'll be dark brown and it will smell of good earth and not smell of kitchen scraps. So composting uses 4 basic ingredients. It's to break down waste, no matter what type of composting you're doing. The first are known as greens, and greens refer to the food waste that you're going to put in your composter, as well as the some yard waste, some kitchen grounds, things like that. These are materials that are high in nitrogen. So greens refer to the high nitrogen materials that you're going to put in your composter. Browns, on the other hand, refer to materials that are higher in carbon. And these would be dried leaves, cardboard, shredded papers. You can use straw, you can use sawdust. They are more of a dry material. Browns and greens will work together to create compost, and they are both an important part of the composting process, no matter what composting method you use. You also need to have air, and that will feed the process and help you create the compost faster. And you add air in your compost by turning it periodically. And I will talk about that later, but in a tumbler, you're actually just tumbling and spinning it. And in a pile, you're going to use a pitchfork to kind of turn it and flip it. Water is also a necessary component. So if the compost pile is extra wet, you're going to want to cover it. And if it's dry, you can add water to it with your hose or just with like a cup at a time. Personally, I haven't needed to add water to my composter ever. And I will talk about why when I get to the tumblers. But you just want to keep an eye on the makeup of your compost to determine whether it seems dry or wet, and then address that accordingly by either adding water or more browns, the shredded paper or the cardboard. There's one final term that you're going to want to know when you're talking about composting, and that is compost tea. And compost tea is a liquid byproduct of composting, and you can see it kind of leaching out of your compost in a liquid form. And it's actually a highly valuable commodity. And so if you're able to collect that compost tea, you can put it on your indoor house plants to feed them, or out in your garden plants as well. And so it's a nice little byproduct of composting. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of composting and how to do it. And we're going to start with cold composting. Cold composting is arguably the easiest method, and it's pretty straightforward. With cold composting, you need a large area outside where you're going to create a compost heap. Typically, fungi do more of the decomposition than the bacteria, so it doesn't heat up the way it will in a hot composting situation. Therefore, it will take longer to create compost when you're using the cold composting method as opposed to the hot composting method. It's pretty mindless. You can just throw your kitchen scraps out on the pile and they will start decomposing. You don't need a specific ratio of greens or that kitchen waste to browns, the cardboard or the paper or the straw or the dry leaves, like you do with hot composting. You do want air, however, and so you may want to start the pile off with some sticks right in the center, and that's going to help create some airflow on the bottom of your heap. And you also need moisture, and so if it's dry, you're going to sprinkle it with water. If it's wet, you may want to cover it with a tarp or some kind of plastic waterproof barrier to let it dry out a little. It goes slowly. How slowly it goes depends on a couple of things. First of all, the size of the materials that you put in it. If you put great big pieces of waste in the compost pile, it's going to take it longer to break down. You can chop up your vegetable waste into smaller pieces before you put it on the compost pile, and that will help speed the process along. You can also layer it. You could do, they call it the lasagna layer, where you layer greens and then browns and then greens and then browns. So every time you put a green on the pile, then you're going to cover it up with browns. And that will help the process happen a little bit faster too, because you're combining those greens and those browns. Regardless of what you do, though, it's going to break down eventually. The other thing about a cold compost pile is that typically the bottom layer will be ready before the top layer. So turning it will help keep the process moving along, but you don't have to turn it. It will just help speed the process. So the benefits of cold composting are its simplicity, its flexibility. So if you don't have time to turn it, you don't have to. If you don't want to cut your waste up and you just put it on whole, that's fine too. It's just going to take it longer to decompose. Don't want to wait for the whole compost pile to be ready at the same time. Then you can dig into the bottom of the compost pile and get what's ready on the bottom and use that when you want to use it. And you don't have to turn it. So there's minimal turning. It just will speed it up if you do that. There are some drawbacks to doing this type of compost pile. First of all, it takes up a lot of space for months at a time. So because it's a slow process, you're going to have to dedicate some space to it. So you're going to want to find a corner of the garden that's out of the way, but that's not too far from the beds that you're going to be feeding, because you do have to move the compost to where you want to use it. So you want it close to your garden. You also want to keep in mind that it's not a particularly attractive thing to look at. So you may want to kind of tuck it in behind a garage or someplace where it's more hidden. You can expect it to take 6 months to a year to produce some good compost. There's also a risk of anaerobic decomposition, and this is when the pile will collapse and air won't be able to circulate in it. That can create a more smelly compost pile that has more bacteria in it, that attracts flies, and it can also attract rodents such as mice or even raccoons. So you may want to have it enclosed to keep the raccoons away. Another thing you can do is if you top it with browns with dry leaves or paper or something, that will also deter the pests. One other drawback of the cold composting is that it's typically done right on the ground, and some of the nutrients can leach into the ground rather than getting collected and used. So it may produce a compost that is a little less nutrient rich than a hot composting method. Using a composting container such as this, like I said, will help you preserve the nutrients, and turning it will help prevent the leaching into the ground. So that's a little bit about cold composting. I will move into hot composting now. And as the name implies, hot composting heats up due to the combination of the nutrient-rich materials, the carbon-rich materials, and the interaction with the bacteria that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. Because it's bacteria dominated, and it is thought to be the most fertile because it composts faster, and it's ready before a lot of the nutrients are leach away like they might in cold composting. So for any composting to happen, you need the ingredients: the nitrogen, the carbon, the air, and the water. But for hot composting to be done, you have to be more intentional about the ratio of your brown material, your nitrogen, your carbon-rich material, and your green material or your nitrogen-rich material. So some experts say that you want maybe 30% of the brown material to 70% of the green material. Some experts say you want it to be more like 50-50. Could you mute, please? But you can kind of tell what your compost needs by the way that it looks. So if it looks really, really wet, then you're going to want to add more browns. If it looks really, really dry, then you're either going to want to add some water or you're going to want to add more greens. Hot composting is done in a contained compost bin. And this will allow the bacteria to kind of heat up the pile within that contained structure. So you will start by collecting your kitchen scraps, your fruit and your vegetable scraps. And then every couple of days, you'll take it out to your composter and you'll put the kitchen scraps in the composter. And then you'll add an equal amount or a little less of dry material like the paper, shredded paper or cardboard or straw. And then you're going to tumble it or toss it to kind of get the air circulating in it. If you see flies or fruit flies swarming around it, that's another sign that you're going to want to add some more brown material to it. There are going to typically be some flies, so you want your compost pile kind of away from the house, but you shouldn't be smelling strong odors. You shouldn't see a whole lot of swarming flies. And if you do, you definitely want to put more brown material in there. Even if you don't get the exact right ratio to heat it to its maximum potential, you're still going to get compost. It just may take it a little bit longer. And then you want to make sure that you remember to mix or turn that compost, every 2 to 3 days, once or twice a week at least. And so that's a little bit about how hot composting works. The third method of composting is worm composting or vermicomposting. And if you're interested in composting year-round, or if you have if you live somewhere where you don't have access to an outdoor space for composting, but you still want to compost, then worm bin composting is probably going to be the right answer for you, because it can be done indoors and it can be done in a small space and it can be done year-round. A worm bin, it can be something as simple as just a plastic bin that contains the materials necessary to feed your worms so that they can create your organic compost. So you start by filling a plastic bin halfway filled with moistened bedding material. And this is going to be that brown material that I talked about earlier. So moistened cardboard, paper, the cocoa coir, the hair of the coconut, straw and hay, fall dried leaves, wood chips, all of these can be bedding material for a worm. The moisture content of your bedding should be about the same as like a damp, well-wrung sponge. On top of that, you're going to sprinkle coffee grounds or sand, and this is going to provide some grit for the worms' bellies right when they're getting started. Then you're going to settle the worms on top, and you use red wiggler worms for this. I think you can order them online. Get them at a garden store maybe. But you're going to cover the bin then and let it sit for about a week before you even add any kitchen scraps. You want to kind of get the worms going. The first week, you're going to cut or chop up your kitchen scraps into 1-inch chunks. And you're going to add about 4 cups and no more. And you're going to cover it then with some new bedding material and then cover the lid. And you're going to wait several days before you add any more scraps, because you have to allow the worms to get started. Worms can't eat the food scraps until they start to decay, so you have to give it time for it to decay and then for the worms to begin eating. If you put too much food scraps in your bin, then more than the worms can handle, you're going to start getting a smelly, kind of soggy bin of rotting food scraps, which you don't want to have because it's going to be, in your house or near your house. So you want to give the worms time to start slow. And then once they've began to multiply, then you can start adding a layer of food scraps as often as once a day. And you're always going to then cover it with your brown material. And that's going to help keep flies away, fruit flies from developing, and smell. It'll control your smell. Once your composter is full and you have nowhere else to add things to it, you've got to empty it, and the compost will be ready. So there are a couple of ways you can empty it. You can do the dump method, where you put a tarp on the ground and you dump the entire contents of the composter out, and then you pick out the worms and put them back in the compost and start all over again. And you take the compost that's left and you use it in your garden. The second option is to simply remove the lid and expose the finished compost to light and air. And the worms are not going to like the light, and they're going to burrow down to get away from it and to get to the darkness. And then you can take the top layer of compost off and use that, and then keep going. And if you do this over the course of a week or so, you'll be able to gradually remove the finished compost, maybe getting a couple of worms, but not having to go through the whole worm pile and putting them back in the compost bin. Finished worm compost can be stored. It doesn't have to be used right away. And and you can also use the compost tea, as you see in this picture here. Somehow I think my thing got off. Let me fix this. The bottom of this this is a picture of a worm composter, and the compost tea will come out of the spigot at the bottom. I just want to get this fixed. Sorry. Just like in a regular compost pile, it's important that you maintain that balance of carbon and nitrogen inside your worm bin. So you're going to put the greens down to feed the worms and then put the browns on top. Unlike an outdoor composter, worm bins are best at composting your household's kitchen waste, but not garden waste. So you don't want to put any of your garden waste in there. The outdoor compost, you can put weeds in there, you can put cuttings in there. Your garden waste can go into the outdoor composters, but not the worm composter. In addition, it's recommended that you avoid fruit waste, because you're going to get fruit flies if you put fruit waste in your worm composter, and since it's going to be in the house, you'll want to avoid that. You also want to avoid eggshells, because worms can't digest eggshells. And any meat and dairy products, which you want to avoid with all composters, and I will get into that in a little bit. Your worm bin needs to be located somewhere where the air temperature is between 50 degrees and 80 degrees. So what that means is, in the summer months, you can put it in a shady spot outdoors. You don't want it in the sun. And when the weather turns colder, you'll want to move your bin to the basement or a heated garage. And in cooler temperatures, the worms are going to slow down. So if you want to keep them working quickly, if you want to keep producing a lot of compost during the winter, then you're going to want to try to find a place in your house. Maybe tucked out of the way, but indoors, maybe in your basement. Worms, a benefit of the worm composter is that they work really fast. And so they can convert kitchen scraps to finished compost in less than 2 weeks. Another benefit, as I mentioned, is that worms work all winter long. So you can keep your bin in your house and keep producing that compost through the winter, and keep composting those scraps so that you're not throwing them out. And like I said, while you can use a simple plastic bin that you purchase at Target for composting, if you're really serious about worm composting, you might want to invest in a composter such as the one I have pictured here. And this is a pretty nifty compost. As you can see, it's got different trays and different layers. And you start with just this bottom layer where the spigot is, and you will put your brown material and your worms in there and your green materials. And once that composter layer fills up, then you move on to the next layer. And you can see in this picture, each layer has holes, and that will allow the worms to work their way up the composter. And so as you add fresh material to the layer above, you are going to be drawing the worms upward. And so that will allow you to take the bottom layer out with the finished compost and no worms. And it makes collecting your compost a lot easier than if you just use a big plastic bin. And you'll also be able to easily retrieve any compost tea that is produced as a byproduct in worm composting. So let's talk a little bit about what can actually be composted. Obviously, fruits and vegetables, don't do fruits if you're doing the worm composting inside, but all fruits and vegetables. You can compost, you know, lemon rinds, you can compost avocado pits. They take a longer time to break down, but you can do it. You can compost the outsides of your onions. You can compost fruit from your refrigerator that has developed mold. You can put that in there. If they, you know, food that has gone bad in the refrigerator, if it's fresh, you know, vegetables and fruit, you can compost those. You can compost eggshells. They take longer to break down, so you may want to break them into pieces before you put them in your composter, but they definitely are good for your soil. You can compost coffee grounds and even coffee filters. You can compost tea bags and nutshells, which will take longer to break down. You can shred newspaper and use that as your brown material if you want. Paper and cardboard, as I mentioned. You can compost grass trimmings and yard waste. You just want to make sure that it hasn't been chemically treated grass, because that will affect the microbes in your composter. So if you treat your grass, you don't want to put that in your compost bin or compost pile. You can compost your house plants, hay and straw, sawdust, wood chips that haven't been treated, cotton and wool rags, dryer and vacuum cleaner lint, hair and fur, and even fireplace ashes. Probably what's more important is what you can't compost. The top things you want to avoid are animal products, including dairy, eggs, meat, fish, and bones. You don't want to compost anything that contains fats or oils, because all of these are going to attract things that you don't want your compost to attract, such as rodents and flies, and they can also produce a bad odor. You don't want to compost your pet waste. There could be parasites or bacteria or viruses that you don't want in your compost. And you don't want to compost coal or coal ash from anything. I don't know why you would have that, but you don't want to compost those. So I talked a little bit about the worm composter. I'm going to talk about two other types of hot composting bins that you can use that you might want to consider. One is done in batches. It's known as a batch composter, and typically they're these cylindrical kind of turners that with a crank that you can, barrel-shaped composters that you can turn easily. And then there are continuous composters like the one that is shown here, where you build the compost up inside of it. So these are both hot composters, as I mentioned. So in a batch composter, you are working on one batch at a time. So you start adding your greens and your browns to one side of this composter. And when it's about 75% to 90% full, you're going to stop adding anything to that side, and it's going to start baking, and it's going to start the process of decomposition and breaking down and creating the compost. And while that is happening on that side, you're going to start adding things to the other side. So you always have a side where you're building you're adding to the compost. You never are, there's never a place where you're not putting your waste. So you're always able to compost waste. Once the second side is about 75% to 90% full, you're going to start adding to that side, and likely the other side is done creating the compost at that point, and you're able to empty it and use that compost in your garden, and then begin adding new waste to that side. So it's a kind of a clever system. You can add your waste every day. You can add it every 2 or 3 days. And every time you add the waste, you're going to add some browns, and you're going to turn the handle and add some air to the process. And it's an ongoing process, and it works great. The same thing with the continuous composter. You're gonna, with the continuous composter, you're gonna wanna layer your materials. It's called the lasagna method. So you'll start with a layer of browns, and then you'll put your greens or your kitchen waste on top of the browns, and then make sure that you end with a layer of browns. So every time you add your kitchen scraps, you're gonna put those browns on top again. And it's just gonna create these layers. The tricky part of these continuous composters is turning them and how to build in that oxygen. So you do want to start with sticks and something on the bottom that's going to create some air pockets to get that airflow going. When you layer it, the greens and the browns and the greens and the browns, typically the brown layers are going to have more ability to have some air in it. So that's also going to create air. But one thing that you can do that I've seen people do, now I'll tell you, I use a batch composter, so I'm not as familiar with this continuous composter, but I saw online that you can lift the entire cover off of it and put it to the side, and then that will expose all of the compost, and you can turn it, and then with a pitchfork put it back into the bin in its new location. And so that's kind of how these continuous composters work. There is an opening at the bottom. They will decompose faster at the bottom as you layer more things on top. So you are able to just not worry about turning it as much and get the ready compost at the bottom, and then everything will move down, and you'll keep building up the compost as you go, and that would be another way to handle the turning and getting the air going. So just a couple tips that I've picked up from composting. I like the idea of having one of these countertop composting bins sitting right on your kitchen counter, and as you're cooking, you can chop your vegetables and put the tops or the ends or the skins directly into that bin as you're working. They sell them with filters in the lid so that any odors are trapped inside of it, and they do work. I've collected onions and all sorts of smelly things in my countertop compost bin, and you can't smell it. And then once it's full, you take it out, you dump it, you bring it back in. Mine has an inner lining that can get rinsed and washed out before I start collecting in it again. So that's a really great way to help manage your indoor waste. Another thing is, if you start your composting with a shovel of good dirt from your yard or your garden, you're starting by putting some microbes into your compost bin, and that's going to help speed the process along. Another thing that will really help speed the process is to chop your waste into smaller pieces. And the smaller the pieces, the faster they are going to break down and become that really good compost that you're aiming to get. And then finally, just pay attention to the consistency of your compost. And if you find it getting smelly, if you find there being too many of the big black flies swarming around it, then just add shredded newspaper. I just take my newspaper and shred it and throw a whole bunch of that in there and churn it up, and that will get rid of the smell, it will get rid of the flies, and it will keep the process going. One last thing that I did not put on the slides is what to do in the winter. And the composting is going to stop. There's going to be very little breakdown during the winter. You can continue to put things in your compost bin all winter long. It's going to fill up and nothing's going to happen to it until it starts getting warmer out. But you can do that. You can also store it in little Ziploc bags in your freezer inside until it gets warm enough outside to start creating compost. But I just go ahead and continue to put the waste in the bin during the winter, knowing nothing's going to happen. So I want to have an empty bin at the beginning of the winter, empty it out, get all the compost out. But there's plenty of space if you use those double-sided tumblers to kind of get stuff collected so it's ready to go in the spring when it starts to heat up. And that is the end of my presentation. I'm welcome to take any questions. One question I have is, do kitchen scraps need to be cut up very much for hot or cold composting? The answer is they do not have to be cut up at all. But by cutting them up, it will help speed the process. You know, I've put entire, lemon rinds in the compost pile and they break down just fine. I've chopped them up into smaller pieces. They break down a little bit faster. So you can do it either way. If you're hot composting, the smaller you cut up the scraps, the faster it's going to heat up and really speed up the composting process. In terms of grass clippings, I had a question, are grass clippings considered greens? And they are considered greens. So dry leaves are not considered greens. Grass clippings are greens because they're moist and they're fresh. But if they're dried out and like straw, that would be considered browns. I have a question. Do you know anything about municipal composting programs? In other words, curbside pickup services? And as far as I know, in Hinsdale, we do not have that. I don't know if anybody else knows anything. I checked with our garbage collection service here in town, and I did not see that they were doing a curbside compost pickup. I would definitely check with them and see if they would consider starting that. Check with the Village of Hinsdale as well. I don't know of one as of this time, but it would be great because that would be really easy to just put your compostables out on the curb with your trash and let them and pick it up and compost. And I do know it is a service that's offered in a lot of places. I just don't think we have it in Hinsdale. And that could be because there hasn't been enough interest. I'm hoping that will increase and grow. Any other questions? Well, if there aren't any other questions, I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. I hope you've picked up a few tips. I hope you've learned a little bit and will be able to get some composting going in your yard. If you have any questions, feel free to email me anytime and I'll try to answer them with my knowledge or find the answers for you. Thanks so much.